Hi guys, my name's Gabby, and I am filming this video as part of my honors credit for this class. And I know, sorry, my camera's not that good, but I'll be moving into a PowerPoint soon, so hopefully it shouldn't like really matter. Um, but what this presentation is going to be on is basically it's a PowerPoint of the book report that we had to write. And I'll just be talking about what book I did my report on, a little synopsis of it, the criticisms as to why it should be banned, and then going further in an analyzing whether or not the book should in fact be banned, in my humble opinion. The book I decided to go off of was actually Perks of Being a Wallflower, and this is the first time I ever read this book, and I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I could sing it praises from the rooftops. I thought it was really uniquely written, and I enjoy how fast paced all of the writing was, but at the same time, it touched really sensitive topics without kind of putting any kind of like further spin on it. And we'll get into this later and everything. But highly recommend this book if no one's ever read it before. Though that recommendation does come with some caveats because there's a reason that people said it should be banned. It can be extremely triggering for a lot of people. And I say you should read this book only if you're mentally stable. And we'll talk about that more. But if you are mentally stable and in a good place in life, I can highly recommend this book because it gives everything we're asking it to give. But let's go ahead and just jump right in to the PowerPoint. I will start my screen record or screen sharing, I should say. Okay. So again, the book I chose was The Perks of Being a Wallflower, and my name is Gabby, but my full name's Gabrielle for me. Okay, let's just keep going. Oh my gosh. Okay. So first off, just like an overview of the book, or the vibe of the book, I should say, she's giving main character syndrome. She's giving cigarette daydreams, Tumblr 2014. It's very much like edgy kid going through like this association, coming of age novel where like he's kind of like living kind of what we would call like an aesthetic lifestyle. And it's really good. But if you are of my group, like a Gen Zer, then you kind of know like what Tumblr 2014 was, and that's exactly what this book gives. So if you're interested in that, like that's the vibe of the book. But also before we get into any further topics or discussions of what the book is about, I do want to give an official trigger warning, and that's going to be for sex, sexual assault, specifically date rape. There's drugs, abuse, mentions of depression and anxiety attacks. A lot happen frequently, as well as suicide. So if any of those are going to be triggering for you, I highly recommend you clicking off of this video, though we don't talk about it for more than like 1 or 2 slides when giving like the description of the book. I just want to give everyone that warning because, again, while this book is beautifully written, and I think it's really quintessential for like a lot of young adults to read because it resonates with a lot of people going through any of these events. But if you're not in a mental state where you can relive some of that trauma, then I don't recommend it because it is pretty vivid in its descriptions, which again is where some of that criticism comes from. But just want to give that official trigger warning before we move on. So what's the actual plot of the book? In 5 words, this is a coming of age novel. So this is about the main character or the protagonist, Charlie, and his break into freshman year and coming out of 8th grade to his freshman year. His best friend at the time commits suicide. And so he's immediately put into like the situation where he's thrown in and there's counselors and they're talking about like, why did this happen? Did you not see the signs? Why didn't I see the signs? Is this a bad thing? Is this a good thing? And while this is like the beginning part of the book, it isn't really carried through. It's not really a discussion about suicide and whether or not it's merited or it has any ethical or the ethical implications of suicide. It's more of just breaching on the topic and his experience as to why his friend might want to do it and his grappling with his inner depression later on in the book. But there is a heavy talk of suicide in the beginning. It's also references a lot of like experience of first attraction. So Charlie falls in love with this girl named Sam, and through that he experiences his first masturbation, his first act of like getting hard, first sexualization of women, objectification, and like he's kind of dealing with like what that means from him from the outside perspective, like kind of looking in as to like, why did this happen to me? What's going on? And so there are some very vivid scenes of masturbation and him masturbating to his friend's like naked image in the book. On top of that, there is this overarching theme of the detachment of experiences, or like what they like to call being a wallflower. So Charlie is kind of a person who views life rather than experiences it, as the counselors told him in the beginning of the book. So essentially, it's where he will sit there and watch these experiences go by, kind of compartmentalize them, analyze them, give his own 2 cents, or rationalize what he's seeing without actually partaking in the action. So let's say if everyone's dancing, like, you know, a wallflower at dance would be someone who's just watching, but he watches and he observes. And this is kind of an overarching theme, because when it touches on those further topics of abuse, he's not partaking in any abuse, but he is observing what happens and isn't even actively stopping it, but he does state his opinions on the issue. So like there's this detachment of experiences and being a wallflower in life that he's kind of grappling as to like what life means for him and what life should be doing and what kind of feelings one should experience when truly like living. Again, I really love this book, if you couldn't tell. Furthermore, there's a charmingly frank and forthright writing style. So the part of this detachment from experiences is the fact that like everything is written so frank and forthright. Like if I were to briefly like give a quip, he would be like, and then he hit my sister. I didn't really like that he hit my sister. I don't think anyone really like if anyone hit their sister. That's something about humanity, isn't it? And like it's just like really frank, forthright, like and then it kind of goes into the next point too. It's observation without action or persuasion against like abuse. It's more of like he's seeing everything from a very like analytical perspective. He weighs in on it in the sense of like, I didn't like that, or my personal experiences to this action, whether or not I enjoyed it or didn't, but there isn't any kind of forthright opinion being breached by the protagonist. He's not actively saying like, no one should ever do drugs. This was evil. Like again, for that scene of rape and abuse, he never actively like says, like it's more of like, I didn't want to experience that. I felt really angry that he did that to her. I can't believe this happens. And then he like in the book, he pops some kids' tires in retribution for what happened, but he never actively has a monologue, for instance, talking about the effects of rape and like an individual's mindset and how that could further affect them or trigger them in the long term. So it's not like a monologue of him preaching against abuse or rape. It's more of him viewing what happened, compartmentalizing it, and stating his opinions and his feelings on the issue in a really detached way, which is, I think, kind of refreshing. There's also this open-minded approach to discovery and identity. He doesn't really know who he is, what he's going through, but he has this this kind of like most kids are. They're open-minded to the world when first experiencing things like new attraction, things like differing opinions, different sexualities. There's another main character in this book. His name is, well, there's two. There's one of them called Brad, and the other is his best friend. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name. Pause. Ah. Oh my gosh, I'll have to cut this out. What is his name? Sam and... Can I stop sharing for a second? Oh my gosh. Okay, his name's Patrick. I don't know why I completely forgot that his name was Patrick, but his name is Patrick. Re-screen sharing. So, Patrick is Sam's brother, or a stepbrother, and he becomes Charlie's best friend in the book, and he is a homosexual, and he's in a homosexual relationship with a person named Brad, and Charlie is very accepting about this and like for their identity, and it's just again really refreshing that there isn't any kind of like negative opinions coming from Charlie on the issue. And like I said, again, like if you're mentally stable, I could not recommend this book more. But you do have to be mentally stable because the main character is grappling a lot with feelings of guilt, anxiety, depression, and they tend to spiral a lot. And he vividly kind of illustrates how he's spiraling in those scenarios. So if you are not in a good mental state to deal with that, I do not recommend this book. And also something before we move on is another main point of contention is they do take alcohol, they do drugs, and there are some scenes in which it's talked about where his aunt and his mother and all of his dad's family were all abused. Most of the women in this book are abused. His sister was abused. So if you're not okay with talking about abuse, again, this is going to be a big contention, so might click out of this now. Okay. On to the next part. So now that we've talked a little bit about like a brief overview of the book, what are the criticisms? So in 2009, this book has been banned and on the list of banned books for a very long time. The extension of to how many schools have banned this book, or the list of how many schools have banned this book, is very, very long. This is not an exhaustive list by far as to what the specific critics or specific schools I'm going to point out are in this presentation. But all the themes kind of usually remain the same as to why they're banning this book. So in 2009, the Parents Against Banned Books and Schools Association advocated for a ban of The Perks of Being a Wallflower, stating that the material was pornographic and vulgar. Like I said, this is a coming of age novel, and there are multiple scenes in which main characters are kissing, sexual contact comes up a lot. There are scenes, again, of unfortunate sexual encounters like date rape, and there's also very vivid masturbation scenes in this book. And there's Grandview Heights High School challenged the book because the book deals with drugs, alcohol, sex, homosexuality, and abuse. And this is not just on the fact that like it's pornographic. This challenges was on the fact that it mentions doing drugs, it mentions doing alcohol, and mentions sex and homosexuality, and it also touches on abuse. Okay, but does that mean the book has ought to be censored? So going off of the principle that autonomy is something that we should be highly valued because it's an extension of ourselves, like our bodily autonomy is something that we should hold control over unless absolutely necessary to be taken necessary to be given up. Autonomy is something obviously to be cherished, right? So when talking about like Mill's harm principle, Mill agrees that one should only really be stripped of their autonomy in serious scenarios, like when other people are about to be put in harm. So like the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So in a literal sense, I can wave my hand however I want, right? But I can't wave it and hit you in the face because then that causes harm to you. So I lose the right to wave my hand when it hits you in the face. So I have the right to my autonomy until it threatens others or harms others, and then it should be restricted by the state. The state essentially, or they have the power to restrict it. Otherwise, autonomy should be preserved. And to further touch on this, or to go further than Mill does, I'm going to be talking about the clear and present danger theory proposed by Justices Oliver Holmes and Louis D. Brandeis, which essentially talks about that the harm of literature and the harm of the spoken and written word is not the same as like the harm of like me waving my hand, right? So like it has to be a harm that is imminent, like the danger is imminent. I can say, I want to kill you, but even though that's a threat it's not actually going to harm you unless there's real danger associated in that action. So me saying like, I really hate Domino's pizza, dislike them. Like, I wish Domino's just burns to the ground. Like, obviously, I'm over exaggerating and there's no actual danger or imminent threat in that statement. But if I was to go further and say, like, everyone who's reading my words right now, I need you to rally August 12th against Domino's on Broadway, and we're gonna burn it to the ground. I'll bring the wood, you bring the match. Like, that obviously is calling for an incite of violence, and the danger in there is clear and it's imminent. You know how I'm stating we should harm others, it's clear and it's imminent, right? So it's not some theoretical concept of danger, it's not a vague threat. It's I'm explaining this as an action I am going to take from my words, and I'm willing to incite violence. So therefore, that's when the clear and present danger theory comes in, and the word should be restricted to preserve the intactfulness of others, to not harm others, essentially. So it's really just an extension, the clear and present danger theory, on Mill's theory of whether when we should censor others or when our autonomy should be restricted. And that's when harm's present, but like what kind of harm, since the harm of the literary word and the spoken word can be so vague, there needs to be a more direct correlation, right? So like it has to be clear and present danger. So it's really just bottlenosing the theory down even more. Okay, but does this cause harm, right? Is there any clear and present danger within the book? Should the book be censored? And I say no. So going back to some of the criticisms that it's homosexuality, that there's abuse, that it's vulgar, it's pornographic, none of those actually cause any harm. While you may disagree with the principles of pornography or being vulgar, no physical or harm is being caused by those actions. There's no clear and imminent threat. You may state that introducing pornography is a harm that could be threatened, or it is a threat to our morals or something vague like that, but it's still not imminent enough to go further and enact the clear and present danger theory, right? So it's like the same of me being like, I hate Domino's, wish it burns to the ground. That's not really imminent versus me saying, I hate Domino's, Saturday the 12th, everyone rally. Like, that's imminent. So nowhere in this book does it ever actually state like you should kill yourself. It's not advocating for people to pick up the knife and commit suicide. It's only going through the suicide of others and his grappling state on whether or not he wants to like go forth and kill himself, his depression, his anxiety, and his spiraling. So no, this book does not incite harm. There's no statement throughout the entire book that ever actually goes forth and presents anything clear that is a harm or anything that's imminent. So it doesn't meet the clear and imminent danger theory. It doesn't rise to the level of harm, and all of the fear around what this book could bring or why it should be censored is just that. It's fear. It doesn't actually incite harm. So you can have fear that I'm going to swing my arm and hit you in the face, but until I actually do, that doesn't mean you can stop me from swinging my arm. So I get to preserve my bodily autonomy until I breach further and get into that area of harm. And this book doesn't breach further and get into that area of harm. Therefore, the autonomy of the author should remain preserved and the book should remain on the shelves. It's that simple, at least to me. I hope I'm making any sense. Okay. So no, this book does not incite harm. Autonomy, again, is something that should be preserved unless there is harm, and then it could be possibly censored and taken off the shelves, but there is no harm here. So the autonomy of the author is preserved. The book should stay on the shelf. Moving on. But what you might be asking, what about things that are offensive but are not harmful? Surely we can't have people being exposed to things prematurely. Like, you wouldn't give a kindergartner a book on pornography, right? Like, society wouldn't do that, even though you could argue that there's nothing wrong with that from a moral stance. There seems to be a societal convention that we wouldn't do that because of some level of offense we have on giving a kindergartner like a book on pornography, right? So like obviously offense is something to be taken in note of and something we self-censor ourselves on, something that society censors. So we value protecting ourselves against offense. So yes, so like you can obviously censor as well on the offense principle. But what's the difference between offense and harm? For like briefly, we'll talk about that. So basically offense is a state of emotional like reactionary feelings that come from seeing the obscene. So this is feelings of disgust, like righteous anger, like you get offended over something. Those are feelings you're experiencing after seeing something you deem in itself to be offensive. So essentially offense is a perpetuated state of feeling rather than harm, which is an like you're being harmed. Okay. Making a lot of sense here. So offense and harm are not the same thing. And even Fernberg, who creates the offense principle, states that surely offense is a less serious thing than harm for those reasons, is because offense is basically just an emotional state or reactionary state to seeing something offensive or experiencing something offensive, while being harmed is just that you're negatively being affected, like you're actively being harmed against. And while those two often get like connected, they're very, very different, for the fact that like something being offensive doesn't quite rise to the level of being harmful. You experience negative emotions all the time through your daily life. Not everything is going to be harmful for you, even though some things may be offensive. And it's really just a reactionary emotional state, which emotional states and you obviously being shot from someone are two very different levels of experiences. One is a harm being done onto you, and the other is just a reactionary state. While it can be unpleasant to experience and should be acknowledged, they're not to be equated. So let's talk about why, again, like we value not being offended in society. Offense is obviously something that isn't pleasurable to go through, something that we don't want to go through, and something we should actively try to avoid and preserve. So what actually is a state of offense where it's necessary for further regulation to step in, right? Because you get, like I said, you get offended by everything every single day. Every single moment you could be offended by something. I could be offended by this candle that is burning on my desk. The smell could be unpleasant, but to what level does that rise to like me calling for the government to come in and like get rid of these candles, right? Because everyone can take offense to something else. It's a matter of preferences at this point. So to give a little more structure to the offense principle, Fernberg comes up Fernberg comes up with the offense principle, and it basically is three prongs, or has three prongs. It states that the offense of the offense principle has to have an intensity and durability to the offense. So it can't just be like a slight dislike. You can't just simply be like a little bit disgusted. It has to be an intense emotional reaction, and it has to be one that is continuous. It has to have durability. So it can't be something that's like a quick, like, ugh, no, and you move on, because obviously that doesn't actually really affect you long term, not enough for someone else's autonomy to be restricted. So it has to be an intense reaction and one that is long term for you, something that has durability. And second, there has to be an ease of which unwilling witnesses can avoid the offensive displays. So basically saying, if you can escape the defense or the offense by itself, and it's very easy for you to kind of detract yourself from the situation, then it does not rise to the level of intervention. So if I cut my hair and you find it really offensive, you can simply just look away from me or not contact me or not approach me on the street. We're never going to see each other again. You'll never have to look at my hair again. And the ease in which you can avoid that offensive display is very easy, right? If I were to tie you down in a chair and force you against your will to watch a really offensive video, you cannot avoid that situation, right? So that's a situation where someone should step in. The offense principle would kick in because you cannot easily avoid the offensive display you are seeing. It's not something you can take into your own hands or solve by yourself. And third, it's whether or not the witness have willingly assumed the risk of being offended, either through curiosity or anticipation of pleasure. So let's say like I'm eating an ice cream and I don't like the ice cream flavor, but if I buy the ice cream and I taste it and it says strawberry, and I apparently don't like I don't like the taste of strawberries, but if I buy strawberry ice cream, I willingly walked into the risk of being offended. I opened that Pandora's box myself. I assumed the risk. So if I can avoid the situation and I intentionally opted to engage in the risk of possibly being offended, then the offense should not be regulated on the offender's part, but on my part, right? So like that's on me, essentially. It's a saying of like, well, that's on me. I should have known better. So basically, the only time something is offensive enough for you to restrict the autonomy of whoever's conducting that offense is if it is truly intense emotional response that is durable and like haunting. Basically, it lasts for a long time. You cannot escape the situation, and you did not assume the risk. It was not your choice to possibly be offended. Like if I go in to kiss someone and I say, yeah, I want to kiss you, and I kiss them and I don't like it, and like I can't be like, oh, you know what? I hated that. You know what? I'm suing you for kissing me. Like if he continues after I said no, that's a completely different story. But if I engaged in the action and I then retroactively didn't like it and offended or disgusted by it, that doesn't necessarily mean I didn't assume the risk in engaging in the action and deciding whether or not, in the hopes of pursuing something pleasurable, right? I hope, again, I am making sense. Next. So, does the perks of being a wallflower meet the obscene principle? No, it doesn't. Okay, it doesn't. It simply doesn't. Because based on those three prongs, while I wholeheartedly agree it could rise to prong one, right? Seeing scenes of physical abuse, hearing like the main character walks into a date rape scene and he's in the room as it happens, as she says no, as she's pleading for the man to stop. Of course, that can be extremely triggering on an individual's part. That is an intense and durable emotional reaction that anyone could have to such a volatile, disgusting situation. So I wholeheartedly, no one is arguing that it doesn't meet prong one of the offense principle. It can be a very intense, disgusting, and durable feeling that could be evoked from this book. But does it rise to meet prong two? And I don't think it does. So basically, prong two again is the ease in which you can escape the situation. If you are reading this book and you happened upon a scene that really truly disgusts you or offends you, the ease in which you can escape the situation is very easy. You can simply close the book. And in that way, you will no longer have to be exposed to whatever is offending you. So it does not meet prong two that the offense is inescapable. It's very easy to escape, to stop whatever is offending you by simply just closing the book and walking away. So it does not mean prong two of the offense principle. Let's talk about prong three, which basically is whether or not you walked into this yourself. And again, yes, if you pick up a book to read in the hopes of enjoying it because you're curious or you have hopes of getting pleasure from the book, and you happen upon something that simply disgusts you, you don't like, or is just offensive, you assumed the risk by reading the book yourself, right? That's on no one but yourself. If you simply did not like the material written or it offends you, it's very easy to avoid to walk into the third prong, right? No one forced you to read this book. It's something you would pick up off the shelf yourself, something that you could easily avoid yourself, and something you could put down and away. So no, the offense principle does not kick in for the perks of being a wallflower because it simply does not meet prongs two or prongs three. And therefore, even while you may have had an intense, durable, negative reaction to the scenes elicited within the book, because again, they can be quite triggering, it does not rise to the level of you censoring the book for other people, right? You can censor it for yourself, put the book down and walk away, but it doesn't mean that you can then retroactively take the book off shelves so other people cannot experience that. It doesn't mean you have the right to further enact or restrict the author's autonomy and take his book off the shelves. So no, it does not rise to meet the offense principle, and it should remain on the shelves. Thank you. But there's an interesting point when talking about this that I think should be acknowledged as well, is that is simply talking about whether or not it should be allowed in libraries, in schools, whether or not it should be restricted off the shelves. But what happens when it's part of required reading? That changes the offense principle quite a lot. I think that's obvious why it changes the offense principle. And two big cases I want to talk about were schools such as Wilford High School in Connecticut and Comac High School in New York. Both had the perks of being a wallflower on their assigned reading list, which I actively disagree with. I don't think it should be on the assigned reading list, and for specific reasons, right? Because when it's assigned reading, it's not escapable for students. When you have no choice whether or not to read a book or fail a class, it's no longer easily avoidable. You can't simply close the book and walk away without risk of failure to your grade. So no, the second principle, like the ease in which you can walk away, it isn't easy. So the second principle does in fact kick in there. And again, the third principle on whether or not you willingly walked into it. If it's required reading, you didn't willingly walk into anything. You had no choice but to read it. You didn't do it out of personal curiosity or the hopes of finding pleasure. You read it because you were forced to, and you couldn't put it down unless risk of failure. So the second and the third principle do kick in. I do think it meets the obscene principle. And I want to say, like, truly, this book can be very triggering for a lot of people. Topics of sexual assault and abuse are not something to be taken lightly, and to force individuals to read this for their class without any other option or alternative book that they could supplement instead is something I wholeheartedly disagree with. That should be part of the curriculum. I do not think that this book, no matter how much I love it, should be required reading for those reasons, because not everyone wants to be re-triggered or re-traumatized when reading a book, especially if it's inescapable and you have to read it in a public school setting and then take tests on it and read chapter by chapter. It's an extremely triggering process. And I don't think that this book should be allowed or required in that scenario. So that's a scenario where I do think the obscene principle is met, and I don't think it should be required. Do I think it should be off the shelves completely? No, wholeheartedly no. I just don't think it should be required. I think it should stay in libraries. I think it should be an option for people to read, but I do not think a school should require the perks of being a wallflower without at the very least, giving the option for people to opt out and supplement in a new book, and giving a vast trigger warning before making people or assigning the book to individuals. I think it's negligent and, quite frankly, irresponsible to make this part of required reading without giving any trigger warnings to people, and then having them not be able to supplement out or get a different book and have to be re-traumatized by their public school. I think that's egregious. I truly wholeheartedly do. So that is a scenario where I think the obscene principle kicks in for the right reasons, and that it should be censored and it should not be on the required reading list. Again, it should remain in the libraries, but should wholeheartedly not be part of the required reading. And then here are all of my references. And that is the end of my presentation. I just want to thank everyone who made it this far. If you were actually watching, I really appreciate it. On top of that, though, I again would just like to state I really, really, really loved this book. I think it is a great coming of age novel. It has a really refreshing take on abuse, sexual assault, first attractions. I think it talks about suicide and depression without actually, it never talks about it negatively or too positively. It's just an opinion piece on one person's perspective. And I think that's a really refreshing take to have. It talks about how sad it is and it doesn't glorify it by any means, but I think it is really refreshing in its forthright and wallflower or detached approach to seeing the world. And I think if you haven't read it, I would highly, highly recommend it. Again, with that caveat of those trigger warnings and with the caveat of like, please do not read this if you're not in a mentally stable spot in your life. But if you are, I couldn't recommend this book further. Yeah, so The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. Thank you. I really appreciated reading this book for this class. It is now high on my top 30 books, I would say, top 30 books. So yeah, if you are ever interested, it's a great book. And again, thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions about, or you disagree with me, feel free to message me or leave a message below, and I would love to have a discussion on it. Thank you.